there are 65 to 70% of Americans in this country who can't install solar on their side of the meter. And that's because they either don't own their home or the roof they have isn't suitable for it. So that leaves, community solar as a solution that's not installed on site and therefore, is interconnecting in a field somewhere. From the, sort of technical engineering side of things, it also often means that it's interconnecting at the end of a really rural feeder, let's say. And that can create a lot of concerns about different, technical planning limits that we have to spend a lot of time talking with utilities about how to mitigate, or how to look at those in a way that still allows projects to interconnect while maintaining safety and reliability.
Community solar as the fourth vertical is, for many, the realization of more than a decade of effort to provide an alternative on the grid for those who maybe can't afford to or don't have roof space for solar on their home or in their non-existent yard. How can you have solar on the building that you share with several hundred other folks? One of the biggest concerns for being able to proliferate more community solar and in fact, more solar at all is interconnection. We're going to talk more about the constraint that is interconnection and how we can potentially break through some of the bottlenecks with Samantha Weaver, Senior Policy Director at the Coalition for Community Solar Access. Of course, we are live from our Power Up Live stage at RE Plus Northeast in Boston. The Power Up Live stage is brought to you by Conductor Solar, Encore Renewable Energy, and Solar Simplified. Solar Simplified, one of the aggregators for community solar. Samantha, thank you for joining us here on Power Up Live stage.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Samantha, would you help us understand first with perhaps a definition? What exactly does interconnection mean? And then what's at stake with regards to the import of interconnection and getting these electrons onto the grid?
Yeah, so the definition is an important place to start. Interconnection is the process by which solar projects, including community solar projects, connect to a utility's distribution system in this case. And it's governed by state policies. It's governed by utility decisions around what type of interconnection can maintain system safety and reliability. So it requires project developers to apply. The way to interconnect is to submit an application. And that puts you in a line or a queue to be studied by the utility to connect your project.
And is it just paperwork? Are there monetary sums required for interconnection?
It does cost money. Every step of the process costs money, and the amount of money varies by state, by utility. But it's not free.
Yeah. One of the things that we find is that the biggest hurdle to growth or scale for developers is not just the wait times at the interconnection stage, but the amounts of money required to get into the queue can be prohibitively expensive. We find that a lot of developers have to go raise capital because they spend the available capital on their interconnection queue. They don't have more money for development. So it becomes a choke point, in particular with capital and project momentum and timing. I would love to understand the specific role that interconnection plays at the community solar level. You mentioned that it's feeding into the distribution grid. Utility scale can sometimes feed into the regional ISO or at a different level in the grid. So we're going to focus just on distributed energy. How does the interconnection create a bottleneck specific to community solar? Let's just focus on community solar for the remainder of the conversation.
The reason interconnection creates a bottleneck is there are two reasons. One is because of the time it takes to study projects that are trying to connect to the grid.
And what does that time typically look like?
Yeah, good question. So it should look like about 3 years from the time you apply to interconnect to the time you have permission to operate your project. Unfortunately, in some states, it could be as much as 7 years. There are instances in Illinois is a good example of a state where there are instances where the queue is 100 projects long and at a given location, a given substation. And at the utility's current pace of review, it's going to take 50 years to study the project, let alone
man-hours
build
problem.
it. Yeah, exactly. So again, going back to the restaurant analogy, it's the restaurant didn't hire or didn't call in enough staff to meet demand that day. So this is a perpetually understaffed utility.
It's the equivalent of a really good rural restaurant getting a Michelin star.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Suddenly there's a rush that they didn't predict.
They'll really never, because of infrastructure problems, they'll never be able to satisfy the demand of folks standing at the door waiting to eat at that restaurant. I love this analogy, by the way. Well, then how is, can't we just connect at the customer load side? How does interconnection prevent us from getting more solar deployed?
It's a good question. I mean, with community solar, and I think as you mentioned in the beginning, the key is that there are 65 to 70% of Americans in this country who can't install solar on their side of the meter. And that's because they either don't own their home or the roof they have isn't suitable for it. And so that leaves, community solar as a solution that's not installed on site and therefore, is interconnecting in a field somewhere. From the, sort of technical engineering side of things, it also often means that it's interconnecting, at the end of a really rural feeder, let's say. And that can create a lot of concerns about different, technical planning limits that we have to spend a lot of time talking with utilities about how to mitigate or how to look at those in a way that still allows projects to interconnect while maintaining safety and reliability.
You hinted a little bit at the backlogs in Illinois, for example, potentially up to 50 years. Are these backlogs common, or is this, certain jurisdictions, how meaningful are backlogs as a bottleneck, as a barrier to deploying these projects?
The backlogs are common everywhere, unfortunately, and it's all relative. I would say that in the Northeast, for example, the backlogs are the line is much shorter and the backlog is much smaller than in plenty of other places across the country. That said, I think when we talk about this in general, we did some analysis this past summer that looked at some of the publicly available interconnection queues for DERs. There are not many of them, but the ones that did exist, showed that over 80% of DER projects that were submitted for interconnection over the past 10 years, between 2010 and 2022, are still in the queue or have been withdrawn. So that's 80% of projects that applied over that period of time.
Only 20% of projects have been approved or put on.
Only 20% are online.
Wow.
Which really that means we could have far more clean energy online today.
Well, could we chalk it up to Pareto principle? The 20% of the best projects got online and the other 80% didn't?
We'll never know. Yeah.
Unfortunately, to your point.
While
that could be a logical assertion, we don't have the data to support that these projects are stuck for any other reason than lack of bandwidth and manpower.
Yes. And oftentimes, they're stuck for sort of policy reasons. For example, maybe there's no way to share the cost of an upgrade that's required to interconnect the system. So in other words, the way interconnection works in a lot of places is you apply, the utility studies your project. They may determine that in order to connect your project, you need to pay to upgrade the grid. Say you need to pay to upgrade a substation, and then you can interconnect. The cost to upgrade that substation is typically in the millions of dollars.
And on the low side, hundreds of thousands.
Exactly.
Not tens.
And on the high side, I've seen examples of 70 million. I think the highest I've ever heard is 96 million. But these are things that just cannot make a project pencil out. And ideally, there'd be a way to share that cost among developers who benefit.
That's the point I was going to make.
Yes, that there's a free ridership problem here. It's called the cost causer problem. In other words, if you happen to be that project in line that triggers the need for an upgrade, you pay the full cost. Everyone who comes behind you and is now able to interconnect because of the upgrade, exactly, they don't pay anything. And so there's a lot of work being done to fix that cost sharing problem, especially here in the Northeast.
Sure.
And
what sort of work is being done? Like, what are some mechanisms that that you see promising?
Yeah, the most promising examples come from New York and Massachusetts. Maybe unsurprisingly, and those are state policies that allow project developers to share the costs of an upgrade, usually on some kind of pro rata basis. So, based on, their megawatt share of the capacity that the upgrade enabled. So it's sort of an accounting exercise. It's a little bit wonky, but the idea here is that everyone who interconnects is only paying their fair share for the upgrade.
Yeah. There must be some assumption, therefore, of how many people are potentially going to interconnect down the road, given the upgrade capacity that's being added. But I imagine, to your point, as you said, the line outside the restaurant in many of these locations is quite long. So there is line of sight. There's visibility into exactly what this upgrade would accommodate of the maybe 50 more people that are standing outside. Interesting. I think some of the things that you pointed to were the unpredictable costs and the delays. Are there clear rules around how this works or will be worked out?
Yeah, this is a really important topic. And it's important because it allows, what we need is for developers to have information about where they should apply for interconnection.
Yeah.
Because yes, it provides them with some certainty. It reduces, the need for utilities to study projects that are really just speculative and that aren't actually going to come to fruition. So there's two pieces of data that we really like to see or tend to advocate for. One is what's called a hosting capacity map. I tend to think of it as being like the Google Maps that show how bad traffic is in a given location. So if the feeder is red, the road is red, you shouldn't drive there. If it's red, you shouldn't try to apply to interconnect there.
Where do you find this map?
Good question. A lot of states require utilities to publish them. Again, not every state. Some of them are better than others. The more up-to-date they are, ideally, we want them to be updated monthly. They need to have pretty granular levels of information to be useful. I will say, unfortunately, a lot of the states that require utilities to publish maps don't go far enough at making sure they're actually updated. The goal here is to have information that reduces those speculative projects. We sometimes call them zombie projects because they're just projects that, frankly, developers are using as kind of a prospecting tool to figure out where to interconnect. We want to do away with that. We want people to know where they should be applying. So the map is a good start. And there are in New York, I'd say, has the best hosting capacity map, period. There's a ton of publicly available information there that is immensely useful for developers. You also asked about, how long is the line? A lot of states also require the second piece of information that's really key, and that's the queue. That there's a public interconnection queue. So you can kind of look at the hosting capacity map, find a feeder that is green, and then go to the interconnection queue and see how many other people are waiting in line for that feeder. I think that's kind of conceptually the ideal scenario.
Yeah, and there's not a software provider or five that are trying to ingest this data and provide predictive analytics for developers? Or is there, I guess, is the question?
There are a software developer or two that I'm aware of that are thinking about how to optimize the interconnection study process based on that kind of data.
Okay.
Yeah, and one of the barriers is data access, again, with the exception of New York. There are a lot of instances where none of this data is ingestible or downloadable in any way. And that's a problem. It's something we are advocating to fix too.
So within the realm of community solar, there has to be a state level regulatory policy like Maryland and New York and notably Illinois, the many parts of the Midwest, including Colorado, Minnesota. Where are you seeing community solar friendly states? Even if it's not necessarily at the utility interconnection level, where are you seeing that from the perspective of CCSA that more developers are focusing their attention?
Definitely, as with most things here in the Northeast, there remains a lot of attention. I think, again, to use New York as sort of the poster child, New York has installed already 6 gigawatts of distributed generation. So not just community solar, but largely community solar. It's still the biggest community solar market in the country. Massachusetts is right behind it, right up there as well.
Yeah.
The state that I have the most hope for is Maryland.
Yeah.
I think they have some really good foundational policies and regulations in the works that I hope spur more growth there. And on the interconnection side of things, there is what I think is a very effective working group and kind of emerging partnership with utilities there to make the process better.
You must see a lot of examples where the interconnection process effectively squashes the hopes and dreams of a project that should have lived. You know, what sort of stories from the front lines can you bring to us that help it give credence to this idea that we really need to have a better understanding or better transparency, visibility into the interconnection process?
Yeah, I do regularly ask CCSA members for stories from the front lines. I call them horror stories because I think stories are impactful. Interconnection is a wonky topic. The stories help get the message across. And I like to say that at the end of the day, interconnection, especially when it comes to community solar, is about people. And it's about making sure that people, whether it be landowners that are leasing their land to a developer and receiving important income from that, or customers who are benefiting from the bill credits they receive when they subscribe to the project. The interconnection backlogs really affect these people. And I think the story that sticks the most in my mind is one about a landowner who had planned to lease their land for a community solar project to fund their daughter's college education. Due to delays and costs, the project never moved forward, and the daughter couldn't afford to attend her chosen school.
Oh, no.
So again, these are real world impacts that that we don't that we don't want to see anymore. So.
Yeah, and the reality is that a lot of these counterparties, in particular the families who would receive income from the lease payments, they not only have no control, but they see it as an alternative where they are saying, all right, I'm actually going to put my otherwise revenue generating asset sort of up into this process. And they may even put the alternative revenue options on hold while they're waiting for this asset to materialize, right? Which is in many cases a commitment of upwards of 15, 20, 25 years of that asset. So it is it's a great way to share that this has a meaningful impact on, by and large, rural families who are trying to figure out, sustainable solutions for alternatives to agricultural crops for families that have been in the agricultural industry for decades, maybe centuries.
Exactly, and I think that's an important use case or sort of application of community solar is on farmland. And again, these are our landowners with land that may not be profitable for farming anymore. Community solar is a great option, but only if we can get those projects built.
Yep. And ultimately, not only for the homeowner, but for many, many developers, the interconnection queue, the bottlenecks, the unforeseen costs amount to a lot of wasted time and money, which ultimately reflects back on the capital markets. Can I trust the solar industry to deploy the assets in the timeline that investors are expecting, right? Yeah. Turning PowerPoints into power plants.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and when people ask about interconnection, or when they ask, what do utility or what do developers really want from interconnection, I say, well, it boils down to predictability of timelines and costs.
Yep. So if policymakers are listening and they want states that they can look to, you've got New York as a great example. Are there others that are bellwethers where the examples they're setting should be written into the playbook for other states?
Yeah, I think Massachusetts is another important example. And I say that because the sort of typical market progression of community solar, or of states that have community solar, is initially a bunch of developers rush in, that interconnection queue, that line to get in the restaurant gets really long. Eventually, they figure things out. They figure out how to make the line move faster. But then what we run into is a situation where now the restaurant's full.
Yeah.
And that's a situation that states like Massachusetts, New York are really facing right now. And I think Massachusetts is at the bleeding edge of figuring out how to proactively upgrade the restaurant to meet demand in the future.
Interesting.
And that's a technical process. It's a policy-oriented regulatory process. But the idea there is that utilities have sophisticated means, and there are a number of software providers and analytics companies that have sophisticated methodologies for forecasting future, not just growth from community solar or distributed generation, but also load. So, data centers coming in, customers electrifying their vehicles. It makes sense to more holistically and proactively plan the grid so that, the restaurant doesn't get full, and so that we can accommodate not just more distributed generation, but also future electrifying load. And the idea here is that, everybody in that list of examples benefits from these upgrades, especially on a proactive basis. Because the once the restaurant gets full, it gets more complicated to get more people in there. So we want to avoid it getting full all the way.
As the nonprofit entity that helps to foster the education, the policy sort of idea sharing and best practices sharing for the industry, I'm curious, what policy changes do you believe could improve interconnection?
States looking to improve interconnection should start by looking at two things. First is requiring predictability.
Yep.
I said earlier that what developers really want is predictability of timelines and costs. States can do that by ensuring that their existing interconnection rules contain clear timelines. You'd be surprised at the number of states that don't require the interconnection process to proceed on any sort of timeline at all.
Sure.
And then in addition, finding a way to improve the predictability of the cost estimates for upgrades that developers receive. States like Massachusetts and California have done a good job setting what's called a cost envelope. So in other words, sort of mandating that the estimate the utility provides has to stay within a certain range once it's actually charged to the customer. So that prevents those surprise upgrade costs. I talked about earlier. It
allows for pro forma models to be built that have a downside risk. Yeah.
Exactly. And the last thing is something we mentioned already, which is to require transparency. And that looks like providing data on what does the interconnection queue look like, a hosting capacity map. In other words, where's the most efficient place for a developer to apply for interconnection. But again, both of those data sets have to be accurate and they have to be up to date to be useful.
One of the things that I could never understand is with the data that the utility is getting, why there isn't more proactive grid planning, meaning it often is a wait and see approach. Rather, in the days before there was prolific sort of generation placement along different spots in the grid, the utility in their integrated resource plan, IRP, had to think about where's our next distribution feeder going to be, what's the upgrade going to be, how long out will we have to upgrade these substations. It seems a little like the utilities, they want to act as though they're caught on their heels, but the real issue is that the nature of the utility planning cycle has hamstrung the process. Is there any sort of reform around the IRP process and around how utilities are mandated at a state level to look forward and think about their grid planning that we can look forward to?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. And I think this is a really good question and another sort of important topic that, I could go down a rabbit hole on. But I think the short answer is absolutely yes. And the way that I've seen that work best is not necessarily in an IRP, but in a similar exercise called a distribution system plan. And ideally, what that looks like is utilities are required to, forecast out what they think load is going to look like. So how many customers are going to electrify? How many data centers will we have? As well as what will, residential solar, community solar, et cetera, look like 5-10 years from now?
Right.
And how do we invest in the grid accordingly to accommodate that? I think the thing utilities need the most from regulators is some level of certainty and of cost recovery. Utilities are very worried about, being denied cost recovery for these investments in a lot of states. I'd say maybe not in the Northeast, but finding ways for the commission to for the Regulatory Commission to say that it's part of state goals for utilities to proactively plan, and that those investments are expected. I think that would go a long way in making them feel a little more comfortable proposing things that, frankly, are in their interest. I mean, most utilities earn a rate of return on investment.
In summary, interconnection is one of the critical pathways. It's one of the critical bottlenecks preventing the ability for community solar to scale. Is there anything that, from the CCSA's perspective, you all feel is maybe a public service announcement? Is there something that, as an industry, we can be doing better to be allies to the utility rather than be confrontational, complaining, sort of making enemies with the utility? How do you think about that within the membership at CCSA?
Yeah, utilities absolutely have to be a partner with us on interconnection. And we've seen a lot of great partners in particular, again, northeastern states, New York, Massachusetts, again, in particular. That said, the other thing I think is important for everyone in the picture to remember is that interconnection, while on its face is a technical issue, it's an engineering issue, almost all of the solutions are policy or business process related.
Right.
So in other words, you don't need to be an engineer to help improve interconnection. I think I'm, a walking example of that, but I would also want to convey that to regulators themselves, who I think often defer so much to the utilities' way of doing things when they look at ways to improve.
Yeah. Well, I think that you are a walking example, not only that policy matters, but that change is possible. And I am really grateful for the work that CCSA continues to provide, not just showing where good work is being done, but helping enroll the agents on both sides of the aisle in the kind of positive action required to move these bottlenecks out of the way and to facilitate interconnection queues that aren't 50 years long and where we get more than 20% of the applicants through the queue in a reasonable amount of time.
Well said.
Samantha Weaver, thank you for joining us from CCSA. I appreciate you taking time out to come by the Power Apply stage.
Thank you so much.